Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our presentation, how standards help to print the expected. Unfortunately, I won't be with you on site, but yeah, we planned to have an online session and Q&A session after the presentations. So I'm Andy Kraushaar and I'm with FOGRA for now over 20 years, and I'm the head of the pre-press department here at FOGRA Munich. And that's the agenda for the next 30 minutes. Also, I would like to start with explaining what a FOGRA is, where FOGRA comes for, and then to just dive into ISO standards and their meaning, their use, their pros and cons for vendor-neutral, predictable printing. And then very important to understand the most known ISO standard with 647-2, which is important to understand because they gave birth to the genesis of FOGRA39, the de facto standard for global data exchange. And at the end, we would like to shed some light on how standards change or drift a little bit to reflect some trends we see in our industry, from more bottom-up standards where we define the processes and see what comes out, to a process agnostic kind of standardization to see, okay, that is what customers want. They are not have an urgent desire on how exactly you are doing, what is the printing technology used or the exact way. They are more interested in the result, in the color appearance of the final printed label, for instance. And so that is something we will see here in the course of that presentation here. And so that will really give us the helicopter perspective to see, okay, what is the referee here first in the industry and why we need that neutral, independent evaluation. As you can see here, FOGRA was founded in 1951 and it's just located here in Munich. There is no FOGRA UK or FOGRA Americas or FOGRA Asia, with 50 staff here on site, and that was developed or initiated by the small and medium enterprises, as print service providers used to be and still are the majority worldwide. And they said, okay, we cannot afford independent research. We don't have an R&D department. And so why not just putting some money together and create such independent research organization who is doing that applied research for us to help us sorting out reasons for when something goes wrong or other reasons, mostly when they deal with the big, large manufacturers who mostly have an R&D department and they are much more knowledgeable. So they are also kind of looking for a lawyer representing their interest in a profound, sophisticated, independent manner. So that was the birth hour of FOGRA. And in many other industries too. There are plastic institute, wood institutes, and other ones in different areas and industries. And so we are founded by members, and we are actually about 900 members, and more than 40% are not from Germany, they are international members. And with that, we try to be that lawyer of the printer as a manufacturer independent organization. And then the nice thing is that we are not just representing one singular manufacturer like Philip Morris or something like this, just to pick one, but to reflect the whole chain, the whole food chain, from suppliers, plate makers, analog makers, ink makers, press makers, of course, to print service providers, the highest number of members, but also read agencies, pre-press sites, and print buyers. So that is kind of what we represent here. And we try to understand their interests. They are also conflicting sometimes, of course, and so we try to moderate. And with that genesis in mind, there were different organizations like GATF in the US, PIRA in the UK, FOGRA in Switzerland, AIDO in Spain, and many more. And so that is something more or less vanished, because anyone knows, research is mostly never beneficial. So that means you need someone to compensate for that, for the losses, marketing departments, the state or whatever, government. And since there are many programs, tourism and others, no subvention anymore. So that was the reason to change your business model. And we are kind of lucky here in Germany to have some programs, even if it's very hard, to apply for research grants, to see what are practical problems in pre-press, press, materials, environmental problems, to then apply research taxpayer money to solve that with very applied hands-on solution. And that is something what FOGRA is doing, to make applied research to find immediate solutions, practical solutions, not Nobel Prizes. This is not our aim, to be honest, not fundamental research at all, but just looking at specific problems and try to bridge the gap between really the forefront of the technology development and also the right knob in Photoshop or the right things to do just on the press to help press operators what they may do, not only to diagnose a specific effect, but also to deduce corrective actions. And that is something what we see. And so that is the sandwich, so to speak. We are between the different, the board of directors working from the membership and saying what's going on here. And then, of course, the members underneath, the 50 people here at FOGRA. So we are governed, we are damned to neutrality, so to speak. And that is our destiny. And that is what I also like, to be honest. And the turnover is 5 million. So we need to get that 5 million every year, 5 million euros. And so you see here on the slides, we get 1 million approximately by members. That means we are very eager to keep them and be attractive for new ones. Yeah, so you might consider that. Then, of course, that research grants to apply individual projects, which gets harder and harder also in Germany. And then the rest is just doing speaks, symposiums, control elements, licenses for FOGRA, media wedges, and so on to get to the Black Zero. And printers love FOGRA because we simply speak their language. We understand their needs. Many of us has the background in printing or printing technologies, and we represent the interest, and we can moderate between their needs. We know the needs with material change and the influence of humidity and some other stuff, different for each process, of course. And also print service print buyers just asking for 0 delta E for the spot colors and no difference at all and all this stuff. And so we know and understand those difference and sometimes contradicting aims to moderate them and to find a mutual solution. And so we are providing that neutral reports, certifications, and anyone says he's neutral. Any consultant come to you, I'm depending consultant. No, anyone says he or she is independent, of course. Just ask who's getting the money, who's paying your bills. Yeah, and then you see, okay, what are the real interest in the back. So that is what we try to combine, and that is something unique to have that research focus and also the hands-on experiences, to combine those two. And that is what, to stress here Germany a little bit. The blame game, what we see sometimes, we're never getting the flowers here, only the problems when we need an independent third party. And so he's blaming the prepress guys, the data making. Prepress guys has also data makers and suppliers say, oh, they print wrong. Any other printer can print very decent, but that printer is doing something wrong. So we try to understand what's going on. And that's also something I do at the weekends, being a football referee on the pitch. So that is also, quite nicely matching to be that independent guy. And the difference to football actually is that we at FOGRA also build and help building the rules, not only applying them. We are very active, for instance, in ISO committees and invest the time, which is not easy, to represent, again, the interests of our members in those ISO committees to get internationally agreed upon standards for the way to measure and cylinder or other properties. And coming now to standards, to say it very directly, you don't need standards. And if you travel around, you might have experienced that. I admit it's quite old, but it's very different, of course. And you can do it without standards, but it's a pain in the nowhere. And so that is having some standards, some agreed upon ways to do something. That's for road safety, to stop at red and go by green, to power plugs, as I said, or PDF. It became a standard. It was a de facto standard from Adobe, but they brought it for many reasons to ISO, because now ISO committees dictate the future of the PDF format. And printing, of course. And here it is important that those people, the individuals contributing to ISO standards, that is the important constituent. That is the important recipe, that people have some interest, of course, and they try to get a consensus using the ISO architecture, the rules of simple or advanced majorities to get from the idea from a new project to a finished ISO standards. But I also need to say any industry gets a standard they deserve. So it is something not other people do for you. You just need to see what is important to get your software, hardware, or prinware standardized. And now that is, I think, the most technical slide. So just lean back, have a cup of coffee or tea if possible, and let's try to explain a little bit the two trends what we see in global print standardization, which is not of course, but on the one hand that the bottom-up process-oriented type of standardization, when we identify different parameters and we say, okay, those parameters behave in a certain way. And that actually was a real breakthrough, that process-oriented type of working in the printing area now, when we here identified my predecessors here, not me. And that is something very impressive when I learned that with a few process parameters, you can predict nicely, not perfectly, the outcome, the colorimetric, the pictorial outcome, the appearance of a film at those times. And so that was kind of really astonishing to identify 4 primary process parameters, being the paper, the substrate, of course, with the TVI built in more or less, the sequence. You know that if black on yellow looks different than yellow on black, or magenta on cyan, and vice versa. So that is important. The screening, AM, FM, stochastic. So there are differences you cannot compensate on press with oil, pressure, whatever, different Anilux rolls or different tapes. And the ink, of course. If you use different inks, you end somewhere else. So having those 4 recipes and understanding that all the other, even in offset, we have millions of influential parameters. I understand that flexographic printing has also a lot of different parameters, of course. But in offset, we were lucky to have those 4, and not more like you have. And even of them, we can keep 2 of them fixed, like KCMY. So we can, for most reasons, fixate the sequence for mostly commercial printing applications in mind. And then only we can also fix the ink, because for commercial printing, we don't have those kind of restrictions you have for light fast inks and not so light fast inks, or the permanent washable and other constraints where you have different ink scents, even for CMYK, let alone the spot colors. And so that led to 2 parameters being fixed, but we just have 2, just as the inks and the screening, AM, FM. So that means basically if you identify relevant substrates, we have the FOGRA standards. We have the different printing conditions which identify or which allow us to identify predict the outcome. If you have that paper and a press operator who is setting up the press to use that kind of type paper, family paper, coated stock, for instance, uncoated wood-free stock, we will see a few types later. And that is something you can predict. Very cool. And that builds the basis of that 12647 family with the part 2 as the most important standard, the offset printing standard. And so that was the reason to identify what is most relevant worldwide, and people from all areas coming to those ISO committees in Technical Committee 130, TC 130, to say Working Group 3, where I'm the convener for many years, to say I would like to have that paper covered. And so that was kind of a discussion ongoing to see what is relevant and what not. And so in FOGRA 39 just being the most relevant description of coated stock with the nice gamut, is beside other standards also. And print data, designs, films at those time prepared for FOGRA X, for FOGRA 1, FOGRA 39, for a given printing condition, for a given FOGRA standard, can then be printed one-to-one. So the press operator doesn't need to understand ICC and color management and GCR and all this stuff. They are getting nicely prepared data if the prepress makes right, and they just set up the TBIs, the dot gains, the densities according to that agreed upon aims up front, and it works very nicely. This was the PSO, Process Standard Offset Printing, developed by FOGRA, and then later developed that needs and that characteristics inside that ISO 12647-2. And that is the cool thing which works very nicely. But we see more and more, not only the different processes, that in particular for digital printing, that this kind of standardization also for flexo printing is not really doable. Maybe not technically, because you might find, so far nobody found them, but you might find 100 parameters or 50 or 150, where if you know them, you can predict it, but that is not usable anymore with respect to arrange them to get some manageable number of standards, because you have so many printing conditions, so many different configurations, that it makes no sense to standardize them, to make a characterization, a profile out of it, and then again provide the data upstream to Photoshop and co. to say, designer, please prepare the data for that printing condition. That is unrealistic and bullabü, as Astrid Lindgren would say. So that is toward a process agnostic way. When we see, come on, more and more printers just get their spot colors or their artwork upfront defined, for instance, FOGRA 39, we will see later why. Or let me spoiler this, because lack of alternatives. And then you kind of ignore where you're printing on. The customer don't care. Is it hybrid printed, inkjet, flexo, offset? If it's looking kind of okay-ish, color is okay, no much grain, barcode is readable, and those kind of technical attributes making an image becoming a nice image or matching the expectation. Typically the proof being a physical proof being there, or just a PDFX data with the reference being explicitly defined, but just virtually, not as a physical proof if you don't have a proof. So that is something what we see. It makes no sense to standardize components for digital printing, flexo printing, just to say that is the reference printing condition, which is kind of close. That is now the responsibility of the print service provider to identify printing condition which makes sense to match those kind of reference printing condition where the data is now prepared for, being a FOGRA 39 or the replacement 51 or gray cool in the US or Japan coated if you're in Japan. So that are the differences. And then of course you cannot print one-to-one. Of course you can try to do it, but that is just very rough. If you just get the CMYK data and print one-to-one, of course red is not turning green, women are not becoming men or other way around. But if you consider accurate color, that is not important. That's not doable. You need color servers actually who are doing the transfer from the reference printing condition, whatever it is, to your actual fingerprinted house standard. And that is described in 15311, a new ISO standard built, developed, initiated by FOGRA. We are not making the standards. Actually, we are working heavily on it, but the ISO committees discussing them and debating them, and the ISO committee makes the standards, even if we very heavily contribute to one or the other standards. And that is what we developed at PSD, in contrary to PSO, Process Standard Digital, and that is now kind of the overview of those two different ways, different ideas where you can find yourself to say, okay, that is the process-oriented bottom-up process, and on the other side you have that top-down, started with a reference printing condition, a FOGRA standard of some type. Hopefully it is usable and use-suitable, and then try to reference and to render and retarget that kind of reference to your actual printing condition. Yeah, and that the top-down and bottom-up ideas are both covered in that family, because every part is a different standards you can purchase, you can look up online upfront and see some information already. That is what I highly recommend you to do if you're really interested in that. Go to Google and look for the ISO, ISO.org and global browsing platform, and then you can already look at the scope, the introduction, and to see already what it's all about. And part one is giving the outline, the structure of those different parts to come, the kind of the index, which all the other parts follow. So we have part 2 for commercial printing, part 3 for cold set, typical newspaper printing, 4, 5, and 6 is then gravure, screen, and flexo printing. But here flexo printing just following those original explained ideas with CMYK based flexo, which was never really implemented in use as far as I know. And part 7 and part 8 are already reflecting that top-down process, because here it's not saying those are the processes from an EPS printer, for instance. No, it says this is the God-given reference printing condition, and you match it with that edge ruggedness and that uniformity and that light fastness and that color accuracy, and so a lot of criteria. And of course, having that to make the print right needs some accompanying standards for lighting, how to view those one, D65, D50. We agreed for many good reasons to D50 in our industry. How to make your profiles, which ink do I use or do you use? What is the label on the ink can when you purchase yellow or cyan? What is the right setup of measurement conditions to get that right measurement setup? Because even if you have D50, there are more parameters like geometries and tolerances and observers and backing. And so there are a few more parameters to have a unique setup, a complete setup for unambiguous color communication, which is important for printing the expected, as our title for today is, to source, to identify the right references, the expectation of your customers in mind, and then to match it in an economic and efficient way. We've already saying printing condition quite often in the past 15 or so minutes or 20 minutes. That is now again a little bit tricky, so the second difficult slide for today. So bear with me to get that technical understanding. I would like to have that Obama speech with just emotional, but then of course it might be emotional, but the technical details are not always so emotional, unfortunately. But then you have that substantiation to make the right and informed decision. But we see that the term printing condition is really used different. So you have maybe one interpretation of your press guy operator saying, I use that Anilux rod and that tether tape and that machine and that printing speed and that configuration and that foil, and that is my printing condition. The other one says, oh, I'm the plant master or the manager here. I'm not so interested in the specific materials used or process parameters used. I'm interested in, do we get the right out? We have our control elements. Do we see the right inks, the right densities, the right dot gains? And that is the second one. And the third one here on the right is then the printpress guys looking for ICC profiles to do the conversion in the Photoshop color server configurations. And that is what you see here. And that is important to understand. If people talk about printing conditions, it's very easy to get confused. So try to memorize those three different use cases, 1, 2, and 3, to say, okay, in what world are you right now? And one is, again, the parameter set. Two is the colorimetrical aims or densitometric aims. And the third one is a complete characterization with like a FOGRA characterization data set and an ICC profile associated to it. And so with those three types of printing condition, you are very much prepared to understand and follow a lot of discussion later on when you hear the word printing condition. But just try to memorize yourself what they mean when talking about printing conditions, because by just saying the one here on the left, it doesn't need necessarily it is not perfectly mapping to a FOGRA standard. That is just the one in the middle on the right. And here see, for instance, the current standard part 2 from 2013, and that defines 8 substrates, printing substrates from PS1 to PS8. And you see 2 here for sheet fed printing and heat set web fed printing on the right. And with AM and FM, that makes 16, 8 2 times, 8 times 2, 16 printing conditions. Yeah, and that is, the way how you now understand to a 647-2 way of 4 process parameters, keeping 2 fixed, and then having 2 just being identifying relevant combinations worldwide. And so FOGRA39 and 51 reference and characterize the third printing condition, the data of coated stock, and FOGRA 52 represents the characterization data set with the ECI profile associated, PSO uncoated, version 3, FOGRA 52 being the ICC profile on top. Yeah, and that is now the building blocks for bridging sourcing with production to understand that the print service provider, unfortunately, has now the responsibility to identify, to read lips, what might be the exact expectation if it's not really clearly defined, which is very often the case, unfortunately, to say what are the design, the originals, the expectations, the mood boards, and how they make the reference printing print-ready data. And more people get not print-ready data. So you need to make the PDFX data. You need to do the repro, actually, because you don't get print-ready PDFX data prepared in a nice fashion. And that's why you need to do that normalization, which includes mapping if you have RGB data and so forth. That is nicely done today with good color service. And then you do that second step from the reference to your offset print in a one-to-one fashion. No color management involves, just a process calibration if that press is set up in the right way. And if you have your flexo printing or digital printing or hybrid presses, you need to fingerprint that specific combination based on your needs, with the inks being or showing the permanences you need for your use case, for your label application. And then you have a color server who maps the artwork and the technical tones from the reference to your actual digital press, and the spot colors typically directly from the spot color definition or to your gamut of your actual 4-color, 5-color, 6-color digital press or flexo press. And then, of course, I spoiled it already. Why? You see it in the very tiny letters here up front. Offset data is the reference for digital for flexo printing, gravure printing, because lack of alternatives. Based on that information and that success story of PSO and later ISO 12647-2, the authoring community took over the FOGRA standards and swaps for standard web offset printing in the US. And then when people and designers and agencies worked out the data, they just had those data and they did the conversion to CMYK. And so that was the reason why print service providers very often get FOGRA or swap Krakow data they have to live with. There was no important, relevant flexographic data provided to the authoring community. From bottom up to top down, again in a more specific explanation now, we have seen there are the 2 big trends. We said it goes more to that kind of top-down oriented workflow. You ident relevant parameters, your tapes, your analogs, your rollers, the substrates, the pressure all together, and to work out that printing condition, and then to identify your important house standards. That is the right way to do actually. And then that reflects to what we develop with PSD, Process Standard Digital, which can also be applied very nicely to flexographic printing, as it was designed to be process agnostic. And since flexographic has no process standard flexography, in those terms and that understanding, as we have seen before, to have basic parameters and predict the appearance. There are a lot of FDA in the US, for instance, provides some very nice information how something interacts and helps the operators, yes, for sure. But that's not what we consider here a standard, making predictable printing. And so that is the right way to connect it with the FOGRA standard. And what you can see here also is the PSD nicely works for flexo printing, and that is the right way to printing the expected, to print the expected, to achieve predictability. That's the most important thing, that customers upfront can of course come to you and say what comes out, have a look and drink a beer and see what comes out, and do that on a trial and error process. Yes, you can do that, no standards again. But if you want to work globally with protocols and reports, that's something we see as a trend, depending on the niche and the application, the one quicker, the one a little bit more on a glacial pace. That is important. That is something we see. And the better you are prepared, the better you can meet the expectation, or even become a quality leader and a front runner with that respect. So here, for instance, at the last symposium, Andreas Krasuhaar from All for Labels, he has the responsibility to unify, to align different locations, having HP presses and many different flexo presses on site in use, and they has to align them. And he's using PSD to the PSD pyramid to identify the printing conditions, and then going up to match the reference printing condition being the right FOGRA standards. And you see here we have also certified combination press here, what you can see here online, where we see the combination. We don't certify inks, we don't certify software and digital printing, we certify combinations, because you have now learned that the combination makes the game, the plays the music. If you change the screening, if you change the driver, if you change the print mode, ink, it can change dramatically. Yeah, and so that is what we see, and so that's why that is what we can do to provide the mechanics to print the expected. Lord Kelvin said, when you can measure what you're speaking about, then you express it in numbers, and you have to express it in numbers. And that is, of course, contradicting a little bit the art and craftsmanship of some press men. I understand very nicely. However, being prepared for more industrialization of our profession and our printing industry is the right requisite. We see color management cannot compensate for bad process control. It is needing stable printing conditions, so that you need good presses. So you're on the right place here. And so you need to understand process control. Color management comes on top. Is fingerprinting hopefully the nice average of your printing condition, not a fingerprint of Monday morning or one specific moment in time. So I hope you have got that kind of entire picture, and I'm looking forward for your questions now to come face to face. Bye bye, and thank you very much for listening and viewing.